When did Greece become a civilization, and would you define civilization?
It's always difficult to define. I think it's a cluster of characteristics that include urban life, working metals, irrigated agriculture, writing, possibility of state organization. All these things together make up what we conventionally call civilization. And Greece had a civilization in the late Bronze Age. That is certainly from 1500 BC. But then it seems to have lost it. That there was a breakdown of society in Greece. The Egyptian priest said, "You Greeks forget everything, you have a disaster, and then you have to start all over again." Well, this seems to have happened, and so Greek civilization does not really start again till the conventional beginning is the first Olympic Games.
When was that? Okay.
That's 776 BC.
Okay.
Now, Egyptian civilization, again, there's controversy about the date, but I think one can take the conventional date of 3280 BC. So it is a good deal older. I mean, Egyptian civilization was very old indeed, before even the first stage of Greek civilization began, let alone the second one. But here was one of the queens that they were paying tribute to. I mean, this is Queen Tai, who was the wife of Amenhotep III, and the mother of the famous religious reformer Akhenaten.
Good evening and welcome to one of the most important series ever done by For the People. Most of us live with certain assumptions about ourselves and other people, other races, without ever asking where these assumptions and attitudes come from. Most of us are born with beliefs handed to us in musty old baggage. Many times we are too afraid to see if our baggage of beliefs contains diamonds or rocks, truths or lies. This evening on For the People, we'll look inside the baggage that contains information on the origins of Western civilization, or more specifically, the origins of Greek civilization. Our guest is Dr. Martin Gardner Bernal, Associate Professor of Government and Adjunct Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University. Born in London, England, he is a former Fellow of King's College, Cambridge University, and recipient of the Harkness Commonwealth Fellowship, the most prestigious fellowship awarded to international students studying in the United States. Dr. Bernal received his bachelor and PhD degrees from Cambridge. He earned his doctorate in Oriental Studies. He did graduate work at the University of California at Berkeley and Harvard University. Dr. Bernal has written many scholarly works, among them Chinese Socialism Before 1913 in Modern China's Search for Political Form, Oxford University Press, and more recently, Ancient or Aryan, a competition between models on the origins of Greece, Journal of African Civilizations, Denied, The Tyranny of Germany over Greece, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Europe in Comparative Criticism, and a series of volumes to be published in 1987 entitled Black Athena, The Egyptian and Semitic Roots of Greece. Incidentally, Dr. Bernal is the grandson of Sir Alan Gardner, who wrote the standard grammar of ancient Egyptian and deciphered the earliest Egyptian alphabets. We begin this four-part series on the origins of Greek civilization by asking Dr. Bernal, how important is Greek culture to Western civilization?
Well, extremely important, but I think you should really divide it up into its perceived importance today, which is something in itself, and its perceived importance in antiquity and during the Middle Ages and until recently, and then finally my own views of it. So if you don't mind, I'll take it in three sections. Okay. Well, since about 1820, Greece has been seen as the origin of most aspects of European civilization. That literature, art, philosophy, science, democracy are all supposed to have originated in Greece. And Greece, in a way, has been held up as a model of how Europe ought to be, which Europe is striving to gain to reach. So it has been considered absolutely central to the formation of European civilization. This view is, as I say, relatively recent. Up till the beginning of the 1800s, Greece was seen as an attractive culture, a poetic culture, but essentially a derivative one that drew its culture from Egypt and the East and transmitted it on to Rome. So although scholars in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the Enlightenment in the 1700s admired Greece and saw Greece as an important source of Roman culture and hence the rest of European culture, they saw that the Egyptians were the teachers of the Greeks. And no one really considered the Greeks serious as philosophers, for instance, until the 1780s. Before then, the Egyptians and the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia were considered the great philosophers, and Socrates and Plato and these people had transmitted elements of their philosophy. If I could give an example of this, there are a number of texts which were in fact written in Egypt about 200 AD, called the Hermetic texts. These were believed to have been written in Egypt in great antiquity, and I believe that in fact they really do have ancient sources involved in them. Now, the great Renaissance patron, Cosimo de' Medici, who was the Duke of Florence, which was the center of Renaissance Italy, had assembled all the works of Plato to be translated from Greek into Latin. Then one of his agents turned up with these Hermetic texts, and they stopped work on Plato for 10 years in order to translate the Egyptian sources, because Cosimo and his translator argued, who wants to bother with the secondary stuff when you can get to the originals? And these Hermetic texts remained extremely influential to the beginning of the 1700s and were central to a lot of thought and to some elements of scientific revolution. So this idea of Greece as an original culture, as our beginning, or the beginning of real civilization, is a new one historically. And on the whole, I personally am inclined to agree with the traditional view of Greece as a transmitting culture, a very talented people, very attractive culture, but essentially borrowing and modifying in a creative way, but borrowing cultures from Egypt and further east.
How important is Greek culture to high school students, college students, the academic world?
Very. I mean, most high schools and colleges in America have a Western Civ course, which is considered the central part of the curriculum, which will usually start with the Greeks. They may have a background thing on the technical achievements of Egypt or the technical achievements of Mesopotamia, but they will say real history, real philosophy, real democracy only began with the Greeks, and real science. I mean, that's quite funny, because they say Thales was the first Greek, or sometimes they slip and say the first man, they may sort of slip between these two, to predict a solar eclipse. Now, in fact, it's not easy to predict a solar eclipse. You need about 400 years of very good observations, astronomical observations, to be able to predict a solar eclipse. And the fact is that all the ancient sources reported that Thales had studied in Egypt. And it's quite clear that's where he got his observational material, at least, and probably the knowledge to predict that eclipse. So that the Greeks themselves said that most of their scientists and mathematicians and many of their statesmen and philosophers had studied in Egypt. This was a consistent tradition, and I see no reason to disbelieve it. In the 19th century, people have said, oh, you can't trust these traditions, but it seems to me absolutely clear that, well, not absolutely clear, but it seems, I cannot see why the ancient Greeks should have invented stories of their knowledge of having come from Egypt. They had nothing to gain from that sort of story.
So in other words, how important is Greek culture to high school?
Oh, to high school,
and college students.
It's central that it is considered the beginning, it is considered us, and it is often packaged in a way to say this is European, and by stressing Greece, you say that real civilization is a European monopoly. And so it's used in that way to emphasize the uniqueness of Europe and the myth that European culture is self-created, that it didn't borrow significantly from other civilizations.
Specifically, what are some of the major contributions of Greek culture?
Well, I mean, the influence of Greek culture, the influence of Greek literary forms has been immense on later European literature. The influence of Plato and Aristotle as philosophers has been immense. I wouldn't dream of denying that. What I am questioning is the originality of the artistic forms and of the philosophical schools. But Greece has really had an influence. It was the transmission belt and a creative one in many ways. So that all high school children will know about Greece and will be taught that somehow the Greek battle against the Persians was our battle against totalitarianism. I mean, one thing, a myth that goes around is that ancient history is somehow detached and objective. And it seems to me that ancient history is a highly political subject.
What do you mean there?
Well, I mean that the way, which facts you select, which stories you select, which civilizations you focus on, has a relevance to society here and now, in which, so that the Greek history has a social and a political purpose in America today. And the attitude people have towards the Greeks is, the fact that the new Secretary of Education, Mr. Bennett, is stressing the importance of Greek culture and going back to our roots. By our, of course, he means white European roots, is a political act. It is not a coincidence that he comes from this particular administration. So I think that these things are connected. Not a direct connection, but studies of ancient Greek history and the teaching of ancient Greek history and philosophy is affected by the political climate and by what's going on in society today.
How did the Greek concept of beauty influence the world concept of beauty?
Greek models have been considered ideal since about the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century. Until then, most European scholars hadn't seen Greek sculpture. They'd seen Roman imitations of it, and they weren't particularly eager to see it. I think the enthusiasm for Greek art comes with the enthusiasm for Greek culture as a whole. But we are all brought up with Greek art now as the standard of beauty, and of course then we see it in that way. And personally, I think, as far as one can be objective, it is an extraordinarily attractive form. But it, too, borrowed a great deal from the Near East and from Egypt in particular. I mean, the earliest Greek statues, the kuroi, I wish we had some slides of them, but we haven't.
Okay, we'll probably get them.
Well, in fact, we haven't. I haven't bought them, I'm afraid. Have the Egyptian wigs on. They're in rather different form. And a whole lot of the Greek, Minoan and Cretan, that is the very much earlier Cretan culture and Mycenaean culture in early Greece, took on the Egyptian conventions of painting men red-brown and women white-yellow, and a lot of the stylistic things are borrowed brushstroke for brushstroke from Egyptian painting. The fluted column, for instance, which is one of the most characteristic features of Greek architecture, is an Egyptian feature. There are a whole lot of things which have a very, very deep Egyptian influence in them. But I'm not saying that the provincial Greek style hasn't got its own attractiveness. I think it has. Right. But Champollion, the great Egyptologist, said it, Greek architecture is the beautiful daughter of the Egyptian mother. I mean, the sense of... It enraged the Hellenists at the time.
When did Greece become a civilization, and would you define civilization?
It's always difficult to define. I think it's a cluster of characteristics that include urban life, working metals, irrigated agriculture, writing, possibility of state organization. All these things together make up what we conventionally call civilization. And Greece had a civilization in the late Bronze Age. That is certainly from 1500 BC. But then it seems to have lost it. That there was a breakdown of society in Greece. The Egyptian priest said, "You Greeks forget everything, you have a disaster, and then you have to start all over again." Well, this seems to have happened, and so Greek civilization does not really start again till the conventional beginning is the first Olympic Games.
When was that? Okay.
That's 776 BC.
Okay.
Now, Egyptian civilization Again, there's controversy about the date, but I think one can take the conventional date of 3280 BC. So it is a good deal older. I mean, Egyptian civilization was very old indeed,
So
before even the first stage of Greek civilization began, let alone the second one.
From a racial standpoint, who were the Greeks?
The Greeks were a Mediterranean people. It's very difficult to distinguish them from other Mediterranean people. You can do more on language. I prefer to see things in terms of language than in physiognomy. And the Greek language is basically an Indo-European language. That is, it's related to the other languages of Europe, like Latin and Russian and English and German. And it's also related to languages like Iranian and Sanskrit and the new languages of North India. So that's, I think, Greece, the basic population of Greece should be associated with this band of Indo-European speakers. Now, I believe that from about 4000 BC, Greece has been heavily affected by the Near East.
When you say Near East, now what?
Well, I mean two specific areas.
Okay.
I mean Egypt and the Levant, by which I mean Syria and Palestine, Israel. These regions had a major cultural influence from this period. And I think that many aspects of Greek culture are completely inexplicable in terms of other European cultures.
Okay.
Let me give you an example of a word. One of the common words that you find all over European languages is the word for king, which in Latin is rex, in Indian is raja, in Old Irish is ri, it's connected to the German Reich. There's a whole word for king, country, all the rest of it. The Greeks have two completely different words for king. They have a word wanax, and they have a word basileus. They're nothing like this rex, raja, the stem which comes from reg. And I think both can be explained in terms of Egyptian borrowings. And I think this is just an example of a large proportion of the Greek vocabulary, in fact, is better explained in terms of Egyptian and Semitic borrowings.
Okay, we'll come to that.
We'll come to that. Sorry, I'm running ahead of myself.
No problem,
yes?
no
Sure.
problem.
Yeah.
Who were the early Egyptians? How did they look?
Well, obviously the question of the race of the Egyptians is a very hot potato and a very complicated issue. I think that the further back in history you go, the blacker the Egyptians are, and by black I don't merely mean dark skin, but also with other Negro characteristics, and the further south, obviously, you go, so that Upper Egypt, now this is always confusing, Upper Egypt is southern Egypt. It's called Upper because you go up the Nile to it, and Lower Egypt is northern Egypt. I used to find this immensely difficult to get straight.
Okay, let's use our map right here.
Sure.
You can sit down,
okay.
please. Just
it's
go
not
ahead.
a physical map, so I can't really show you.
Right.
But Upper Egypt is now this area here. Well, actually, it goes down that far. It's the Nile Valley. Lower Egypt is essentially the Nile Delta in this region here, going up a little. Now,
Okay.
Egypt is part of Africa. I mean, if you look at the map, you know,
Okay.
there's no question. But it's more African than that, because the ancient Egyptian language belongs to a language family called Afro-Asiatic. And nearly all the members of this family are, in fact, in Africa today. The only one that isn't, and why it's called Asiatic, is Semitic, which is spoken in this region here and always has been, really.
Okay.
Now, my theory, and here I'm relatively alone, is that Afro-Asiatic, in fact, started as a language family in the Rift Valley in Kenya and southern Ethiopia.
Okay.
And that it spread at the end of the Ice Age across the Sahara to North Africa, from Ethiopia into the Arabian Desert, which was rather fertile, the savanna there because there was higher rainfall. And the ancient Egyptians, or the people who spoke the early Egyptian language, moved down the Nile from Sudan. Here, I'm not being so unorthodox. Arkell, who's probably still the greatest archaeologist of Sudan, believes that the cultures he called the Khartoum Mesolithic and the Khartoum Neolithic, in fact, are the origins. Now, there have been some challenges to Arkell's view, but I'm personally still persuaded by him. Anyhow, the Egyptian language is connected to African languages, and the most plausible place it came from, in fact, is further south in Africa. Nevertheless, there are Mediterranean influences on Egypt, and particularly, obviously, in Lower Egypt up here, that this is a coastal area.
Okay.
And my feeling is that Mediterranean types have existed there for a very long time indeed. But African and the African language predominated, so one can assume that African people predominated in this area. But Upper Egypt remained much blacker all the time. Now, as time went on, these Mediterranean and Semitic influences became more apparent, so that the tomb paintings we have, which are nearly all from the New Kingdom in Egypt, that is after 1570 BC, show a mixed population. I mean, some predominant color is brown rather than black, but there are certainly a lot of blacks, and not all in servile positions, as a lot of the scholars in the 19th century wanted to make out. And you have the situation that the political center of Egypt was often Thebes in Upper Egypt, which was still a very black area. So a lot of the most powerful dynasties of Egypt were in fact black, ruling over a population that was mixed. I think, could you have a slide now, actually? Could I show you the...
Okay, we can take a look at the first slide.
The first slide, which in fact is the a pharaoh called Mentuhotep, who was one of the founders of the 11th dynasty. That's about 2070 BC. And he re-established the Egyptian kingdom after a period of anarchy known as the First Intermediate Period, and established what's known as the Middle Kingdom. Okay. By which time I think a lot of Lower Egypt was a Mediterranean population, but you look at him, and Egyptologists will try and say, oh, black is a symbolic color and it has nothing to do with his actual skin color. I find that wishful thinking on their parts. I mean, I'm not persuaded. Actually, he's particularly interesting because it's in his period, he not only restored Egyptian unity, but he expanded his empire into Byblos here, or had influence there. And we know from archaeological finds at his capital, near Thebes, that he was receiving goods from Crete and from the Aegean. And the cult of Egypt during the 11th dynasty was a hawk and bull cult. And it's precisely this period that Crete begins to have a bull cult and to build its own palaces. And so I think this 11th dynasty under Mentuhotep is critical in this respect. I think that this is the... Now, whether it was an Egyptian fleet landing and imposing it, or whether it was a cultural influence, is difficult to tell. My inclination is to believe that there were Egyptian fleets involved, because I think one can identify Mentuhotep with a figure in Greek legend called Rhadamanthus. Rather complicated reasons why I think these names are the same, but it's all in my book.
Buy the book, right? Okay.
You'll see that. But he is described as a judge and a lawgiver, and he brought order to the islands, to the Ionian Islands. I mean, this is the Greek tradition. And therefore, it's... I mean, when one's dealing with ancient history, one cannot deal with certainty, because there just isn't the certainty available. One has to make the best constructions one can, arguing on what I call competitive plausibility, the most likely case, which may be knocked over, but as a working hypothesis, I think one can assume 11th dynasty influence in the formation of Cretan palatial culture, the big palaces that were built in Crete, and of the famous bull cult in Crete, you know, the Minotaur and Minos and this whole thing. I'm sorry, I always wander off.
No,
Once you get me going...
What were some of the major achievements of the Egyptian culture under black population?
Well, in the Old Kingdom, that's before Mentuhotep, when I'm talking about the period mainly from about 3000 to 2500 BC, there were enormous achievements in terms of mathematics. I mean, the pyramid is an extraordinary, the Great Pyramids, which were built in this very early period, are extraordinarily complicated mathematically. that they cannot just be seen as plonked up, that the measurements are very precisely worked out and indicating all sorts of very interesting precisions of mathematical knowledge, which I think this and the view of the ancients that the pyramids did represent sophisticated knowledge seems to me true. So I think that there was a high level of mathematical knowledge, a high level of astronomical knowledge. To some extent this was borrowed from Mesopotamia, but there was clearly toing and froing of culture between Mesopotamia, that is what's now Iraq, here, which had a mixed Semitic and Sumerian culture. And I think the Semitic population, or the Semitic language, spread from Ethiopia, where it still is around, here and into Iraq. So to some extent, this area is part of the African cultural area, cultural region too. So that clearly Mesopotamia had advanced astronomy as well, but the Greeks, when writing about it, never studied in Mesopotamia, they studied in Egypt. And one reason is clearly Egypt was closer to them. So to some extent it's not important which the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians had it first, because the Greeks definitely borrowed from the Egyptians, not from the Mesopotamians, until a very late stage.
Now, we are consumed today, of course, with by color, but were the ancient people, those in Greece and other places, were they as concerned about color as people of today?
No, nowhere near. I mean, I think that there is a tendency among most populations to prefer their own type.
Right.
And I think that's a constant of human culture. But this has become intensified in Europe since the 17th century. Since slavery became a major aspect of Northern European culture.